Hello, and welcome to episode 323 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perridan, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this February morning, Bill?
I'm doing great, Seth. It's 78 degrees outside and still I'm cold. What's up with that? I must be a converted Floridian.
Snow, you're a permanent snowbird now, right?
Well, I mean, the snowbird means you go back and forth. I just stay here.
That's what I mean. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I mean. Yeah, it's a brisk morning. It's actually, as we record this, it is Fat Tuesday. Today is Mardi Gras. Yeah, I don't care about Mardi Gras, but today is Mardi Gras. Anyway. So we have a very interesting topic to talk about today, but before we do, want to do what we always do and ask you to like and subscribe to our channel, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as it helps other people find our stuff. Thank you to those who have done so, and if you haven't, please do so. We've seen the numbers ticking up slowly, and we're greatly appreciative, but every single time that you click a like on that video and you click subscribe to our channel, it helps other people find our stuff. So thank you very much for doing that. So, Bill, as I said, we have a very interesting and somewhat controversial topic to talk about today, but it's important because it plays out really the rest of the Pacific War. So let's dig in, shall we say.
Do we ever do controversial, Seth? I don't think we do. We're always very sedate, aren't we?
No.
And if those of you who've seen the title know we're going to be talking about MacArthur today, believe it or not, it's not all bad.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
So if you think you're going to get another dose of MacArthur hating here, you may get a little bit, but not we're going to try to be balanced.
We're going to be balanced, but just suffice to say that every single thing that we're going to bring up today, and it's not all about Mac either, by the way, just so everybody knows,
right,
that every single thing that we say today is we have documented proof of. So it's not Seth and Bill just, bashing on MacArthur. It's history bashing on MacArthur when the bashing is appropriate. So with that, the Pacific War churned ever forward in the late summer of 1944. The unnecessary bloodbath of Peleliu was still raging in mid-October when the United States set its eyes on the next target on the map. The target, of course, was the Philippines. While many students of the war assumed that that was the logical and easy choice, frankly, it was not. And while many people assumed that the Philippines were always on the target list and we would get there eventually, frankly, they were not. There were other options on the table, namely one, Formosa. The Navy, read Admiral Ernest J. King, favored the Formosa route to Japan. A simple look at the map tells you why. Formosa was much closer to the target of Japan than the Philippines were, or are, as the case may be. It was even closer to Japan than the Marianas. The Army, Douglas MacArthur, of course, felt that the road to Tokyo absolutely must go through the Philippines. Neither road was a clear-cut favorite. Both roads would be a struggle to go down for many reasons. Both roads had their spokespeople, both roads had their fans, and both roads had their share of haters, as the kids say. And for a time, both roads were on the table. And for a while, one road was seemingly going to be the one on which the United States would travel. The ultimate decision lay with the president and his Joint Chiefs of Staff, and yet the decision was not an easy one. The decision and road to that decision was full of intrigue, name-calling, and political backstabbing. At the heart of the competition between Formosa and the Philippines stood two of America's titans of the Pacific War, personalities of biblical proportions, Ernest King and Douglas MacArthur. While never having direct confrontations, the two certainly were the forces behind each side of the argument that Bill and I are about to propose. The decision to go to the Philippines was not an easy and one we should explore from its roots to its execution right now. Bill, I got to tell you, I got to be honest with you. As I was going through the notes for this sucker and building this up in my head, I got excited. I was like, ooh, because it's not well, it isn't. It's not our normal boom, boom, shoot 'em up topic. And it's something different. And it's something that I guarantee you, and I say this often, but it's the truth. Most people don't know, or they don't know the full details and intrigue of what happened here. And it's utterly fascinating. Politics is a topic that you and I and everybody else on the show do not discuss, because as they say, if you want to remain friends with somebody, you don't discuss religion or politics. But we're going to discuss politics on this one because it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the attack on Pearl Harbor, of course, dominated American newspaper headlines and radio broadcasts, Seth, and rightfully so. At the same time, the Philippines were taking a pounding and receiving wide public consumption. The American commanders at Pearl Harbor, Kimmel and Short, were relieved of their commands almost immediately. Some would say rightfully so. And, you know, there was a large debate about this raging from the very beginning. Much of the evidence against these two men centered on their lack of preparation against the Japanese attack. The two men were pilloried and quickly became dark figures, or an afterthought of American history. I mean, you talk to people today, most of them have never heard of Kimmel and Short, right? So, yet the overall commander in the Philippines, one Douglas MacArthur, escaped scot-free, despite the fact he had many hours warning to prepare his forces after the attack on Pearl Harbor began. So why is Kimmel and Short pilloried and fired while MacArthur is held up as a hero? Well, the country at the time needed a hero fast. And as the weeks after Pearl Harbor attack went from shock to revenge, the American people needed someone to get behind, someone they felt was a personification of the natural desire to resist and avenge. Enter Douglas MacArthur, Seth.
And, you know, people are going to say, why in the heck are we talking about the Philippines in 41, 42 when we just talked about 44? Because everything that happens in 1944 and so far as Douglas MacArthur is concerned, all stems from this period in time right here. So that is exactly why we're talking about it. Free of any blame at all, Douglas MacArthur, who was just as much to blame, if not more so, for the lack of preparation against the Japanese attack in the Philippines than Kimmel and Short ever were for Pearl Harbor, suddenly shot to fame in the United States. His face was plastered across newspapers, everywhere his name and ever-present force on national radio. He was everywhere seemingly overnight. And this is the God's honest truth. We've talked about this before, Bill. They made movies in which they portrayed, and I'm talking, you know, we already talked about They Were Expendable. That's a different time period. But in 42 and 43, there were movies where MacArthur is portrayed as this, you know, avenging angel or Christ-like figure. And he was literally all over the map. Now, to be perfectly fair, MacArthur wanted to fight the Japanese in the Philippines. He did. He did not want to just bug out. He was not then, nor ever was, one to shy away from a fight. Honest to God truth. Right. Ill-prepared or not, poor military planning and execution or not, all of which are true, Mac wanted to fight, which is also true, and that put him in good light with the folks back home. Of course, it did not hurt Bill that MacArthur's headquarters issued more communiques than most countries did. And this is the truth as well. Between December 1941 and March 1942, Mac's headquarters issued more than 142 press communiques. All but 33 of those 142 mentioned MacArthur by name and called the ragtag bunch of Americans and Filipinos MacArthur's army, not the more appropriately termed Allied forces or Americans and Filipinos, whatever you wanted to say. This means he issued more public relations reports over this time period than he did battle orders. This is part of the cult of personality that is being built with Douglas MacArthur here.
Yeah, well, and the person building it was him. Many of the communiques implied, or at least straight out said, that MacArthur was leading the troops from the front, which of course he was not. The image of General MacArthur leading his beleaguered men against a tyrannical enemy hung fresh in the heads of the populace, casting the general in an even greater light, true or not. The U.S. government, specifically Franklin Delano Roosevelt, could not do anything against Mac at this time in American history. To be honest, he should have been relieved of command early in January and sent packing because of his failure to prepare and his, poor defense of his forces that were going to be trapped, in a peninsula on the Philippines. You remember we talked about War Plan Orange and the planning that went into War Plan Orange and his deviation from that plan and his lack of providing logistical support to align with his deviation of the plan. Change the plan if you want, but if you don't adjust the logistics to support your new plan, that you should be relieved. I mean, that's dereliction of duty. And that's exactly what happened, which led to wholesale, capture or surrender of his forces in the Philippines. Okay, so maybe he wanted to fight, but he either didn't know how
to do it right
or couldn't fight correctly. So again, desire is one thing, capability is another. So U.S. government could not do anything against Mac this time in American history. He should have been relieved, but the government newspapers and FDR let the MacArthur persona grow to biblical proportions, Seth.
Yeah, they were watching this monster grow before their very eyes, and it's all going to come to play into what happens in 1944. So bear with us. On January 27th, 1942, newspapers across the country said of MacArthur, quote, "He is one of the greatest fighting generals of this or any other war," unquote. Wendell Willkie, who was Roosevelt's one-time opponent, declared that MacArthur should be brought home to direct the war effort. Willkie's words, when read now, would be almost comedic if he weren't so serious in his tone. Quote, "Place him at the very top. Keep bureaucratic and political hands off of him. Put him in supreme command of our armed forces under the president. Then the people of the United States will have reason to hope that skill, not bungling and confusion, directs their efforts," unquote. When FDR did finally order MacArthur out of the Philippines and made him Supreme Commander, Southwest Pacific, SWPA, Dwight Eisenhower, whom I'm sure you've heard of, his former aide wrote, quote, "I can not help believing that we are disturbed by editorials and reacting to public opinion rather than military logic," unquote. Now, Bill, as I said, the quote by Willkie would be comedic if it wasn't so serious when he says, then the people will have reason to hope that skill, not bungling and confusion, directs their efforts. Now, as we all know, and if anybody who's ever watched any episodes of this podcast previous to this one know, MacArthur did his fair share of bumbling through the Pacific in 1942 and 1943, didn't he?
He did, yeah. I mean, that whole time frame, his reputation, self-created as it may have been, would have been saved by competent leaders under him and the tens of thousands of GIs, Australians, Kiwis, and others who endured under his command through 42 to 43. Regardless of his actual failures, his press savvy cast an image of the general that few American figures during the war, probably none actually, would ever surpass. Failures were covered up by his communiques and outright lies told, all in the effort of self-image and his ultimate goal to be overall theater commander over Nimitz and retake the Philippines by hook or by crook. Now, we are piling on MacArthur, and justifiably so, but there's a whole bunch of things that go on here. Remember that FDR's fear that Mac would run against him in the election, that was one factor here. The fact that he basically boxed FDR in a corner when he left the Philippines, when he was ordered to leave the Philippines, to be fair, and said, "I shall return," which basically declared American strategic policy when he didn't have the authority to do that. That's the president's domain, but he boxed FDR in a corner. The other team in the upcoming fight was captained by another guy we talked about. We had an old episode on him, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King. So, Seth, what's his role in what's going on right now?
Well, he's the boss of the Navy. He's the head banana, if you will, of the United States Navy, and he is in charge and pushing for the Central Pacific Drive. We're fast forwarding now to 1943. So bear with me here as we're going to talk about some press relations here as things bog down. Unlike his would-be adversary, King wanted absolutely nothing to do with the press. He abhorred publicity, shunned it completely, honestly, and encouraged all under his command, which is to say the entire United States Navy, to do the very same thing. And they did for the majority of 41 through 44. Now, as we were saying, as Bill was saying, MacArthur was, well, he built himself into this public persona with the help of the federal government and Republicans in Congress and in the government at that time. Whereas he could do no wrong in the eyes of the United States citizenry. Admiral Ernest J. King did the complete opposite. He avoided talking to the press at any and all times. And as I said, abhorred it, basically flat out said, ain't going to do it, and told his officers to do the same. That was beginning to have a negative effect on the United States Navy, as we're going to see. One of the agreements that Ernest King made before, or with FDR before taking the job of Commenge, was that he would not have to give press briefings or have any dealings with the media of the day. And I can't really say as I blame him, because I wouldn't want to deal with the media either. That being said, what King did not realize is that his radio silence in the form of press relations, unlike Douglas MacArthur, actually harmed both his and his beloved United States Navy's reputation and public image. King, who viewed the press as, quote, somewhat above bubonic plague and something to be avoided at all costs, unquote, didn't initially understand or care about public opinion. He viewed the Navy's job as, quote, team before self, unquote, and went down that path for the better part of 3 years. King's failure to properly keep the American public informed about the successes of the naval campaign and the failures in the Pacific gave a bad image of the United States Navy to the American populace. MacArthur, who never shied away from taking a jab at the Navy or the Marine Corps in public, had helped shape public opinion in an all-out effort to gain farther control, to gain overall control and command of the entire Pacific theater. Bill, what was King's aversion, though? What does all of this stem from?
Well, I mean, he had an aversion even before this incident occurred, but I think we talked about this in an earlier episode, and we're talking about a journalist by the name of Stanley Johnston.
Yes.
Johnston had been aboard USS Lexington CV2 during the Battle of Coral Sea, and later wrote a book about it when she sank during that battle. Fished out of the water by a destroyer, Johnston had berthed with several Lexington officers on their way back to Pearl after the ship was sunk. On the way back to Pearl, Johnston took note of a top secret dispatch from Nimitz dated May 31st, 1942. The dispatch spoke of top secret matters, even higher than that, top secret ultra matters regarding the upcoming Battle of Midway. After the battle ended in victory, Johnston wrote an article that appeared on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. The headline blared, "Navy had word of Jap plan to strike at sea." Had word of the plan to strike at sea. The article alluded to the fact that the Navy had pieced together portions of the Japanese JN-25 code that allowed Nimitz to plan and execute the Midway ambush. From my old office, by the way, I hasten to point that out. Thankfully, no Japanese spies either saw or put two and two together. Otherwise, the cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor would have had a lot harder time. It could have really, really stymied operations going forward. So King was livid at this leak and threatened to bring treason and espionage charges against Johnston and the Chicago Tribune. Nothing came of the charges, mostly because nobody wanted to bring more attention to the article. But the damage had been done in King's eyes. King would lock down information about anything Navy related for the time being, Seth.
Yeah. And, I can only imagine Ernest King's reaction when he either reads that headline or gets word that that headline is out there. He must have blown a gasket, and rightfully so. Rightfully so. Ernest J. King is not one of the most beloved figures in American history. He did a fantastic job when he did it, but he was an obstinate and arrogant, pedantic man. And that's by all accounts. He was not kindly, shall we say. He was not a kindly gentleman.
Remember, his daughter said he shaved with a blowtorch.
Yeah. And by all accounts, that's probably true.
Yeah, he's the most even-tempered man I've ever known. He's always in a rage.
Yes. And that is very, very true. While he certainly had to have known that the court of public opinion was ultimately shaped by the perception in which people viewed the United States Navy, realizing that the fall of 1942 was also an election cycle, he knew he had enemies in Washington who might want to oust him should things go the Republican way that year. He also knew that he could not afford to be a lightning rod for hatred when it came to the Navy and its setbacks off Guadalcanal. Now, remember what I just said. This is fall of 1942. What is happening in the waters off Guadalcanal in the fall of 1942? We're taking a pounding. Eventually, King relaxed his hatred, which is what it was, for the press. Urged by his longtime friend Cornelius Bull, King finally relented. His friend hosted a dinner for King that would be attended by press reporters handpicked by Bull and King. There would be no interviews, and King would not be directly quoted, but he would answer questions by the press as long as they did not divulge secrets that would harm the war effort. The dinner that they had in D.C., or outside of D.C., rather, went splendidly by all accounts. The men drank beer and simply talked. King held court for over an hour without an interruption from anyone. Finally, he took questions. He was wide open regarding Navy setbacks and failures and laid out future plans. When questioned why King had failed to report on past sinkings, which was one of the biggest issues that the press had, he responded that he thought that divulging that information might have aided the enemy, and it would have. The end result was a pleasant evening, and almost overnight, the public opinion of the Navy and how they were fighting the war was changed via positive press reporting. King had his secret press briefings for the remainder of the war, usually every 6 weeks or so. You know, Bill, when you look back at it, especially knowing what we know about the Guadalcanal campaign, you throw in Savo, or the debacle at Savo, you throw in, Santa Cruz, Eastern Solomons, the sinking of the Wasp, all these naval fights that are going off the coast that don't always go well. And even the ones that do go well, we take a pounding, i.e. Santa Cruz, we lose the Hornet. You can understand why he was reluctant to release that information for multiple reasons, but it ultimately dawned on him that it was hurting his image. And ultimately, as you well know, if a service branch wants to get something accomplished, they have to have good relations with the American public and the press. And King, it took him a little while, but he finally realized this, and it started to work in his favor, didn't it?
It did, yeah. And let's keep in mind, though, during this period of time, the Japanese Navy was way over-reporting their successes. And that would increase significantly throughout the war. So if, to some extent, there's an advantage to that. If they think these carriers have been reduced and then suddenly, surprise, one shows up. And so you can understand why he wanted to keep this kind of information away from the Japanese, but away from Congress and away from, and to some extent, away from the American public. It was hurting him. So his gamble paid off. Public opinion began to shift, which is what King wanted. In a relatively unstable political climate, King ensured the Navy's front row seat in all future war planning, no matter who was in the White House or Congress. While he couldn't and never tried to upstage MacArthur, it would have been futile. He didn't have anywhere near enough press. His press engine was nowhere near big enough. The joke is that, 2/3 of MacArthur's staff was press, involved planning and press reporting and things like that. He was confident that should a shoving match start between the two, him and MacArthur, regarding future operations, King and the Navy would come out on top. Or so he thought. So what does all this mean? In short, it meant that another war was being waged between the Army and the Navy. What was the goal of this inter-service war? Ultimate control of the Pacific theater. Ultimate control, command and control, whatever you want to call it, would allow that branch to dictate the war effort and unified joint planning and direction, not just joint, but combined planning and direction among us and all of our allies. Or at least that's what MacArthur thought. Anytime he saw an opportunity, MacArthur blew his own horn and that of his command, even outright lying to the American public and his boss, General George Marshall, all with the goal of grabbing the control stick of the war machine and pointing it inexorably towards the Philippine archipelago, Seth. And you can give a bunch of examples, can't you, of these lies? But what's happening first here?
Well, the lies are incredible, and we've touched on this one time before, but we're going to get into it here now by proving, quote unquote, to the public that his forces were actually making progress. MacArthur assumed that his political influence would grow inside and outside the theater, but especially back home in the United States. Example, after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, in which Allied aircraft sank 12 or so Japanese ships and killed roughly 3,000 troops, MacArthur's press team sent out a communique that stated, quote, his aircraft, unquote, sunk 22 Japanese ships and killed every single one of the 15,000 men aboard those ships. Now, again, back to Bill's point. Every side in the war exaggerated and overstated claims. Every single one. And Douglas MacArthur was not the only one. However, the extent he goes,
difference.
Here it comes. Mac claimed 12 transports, 3 light cruisers, 7 destroyers, and 102 Japanese aircraft were downed in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. His insistence was that Army air power, General George Kenney's Army air power, had won the battle, and that the Navy had never been able to touch anything near that mark of success. He asserted in clear terms that land-based aviation had won, quote, strategic dominion, unquote, over sea power. He declared that in the future, who controlled the sea would be decided by land-based air rather than actual naval forces. His direct jab at the Navy was very clear. Now, this is in 1943, following the Battle of Coral Sea, following the Battle of Midway, following all the battles off of Guadalcanal, most of which, by the way, were won by naval aviation and naval air. Yes, Army air played a role in some of those battles off of Guadalcanal, no doubt. However, the vast majority of them in which aviation was employed, that was naval aviation. Never in the history of World War II to this point in the Pacific until Bismarck Sea had land-based Army air actually won a battle single-handedly. And they didn't do it single-handedly either because they had help from the Aussies and the New Zealanders too, just to be 100% clear. Bill, U.S. Navy leaders, of which Admiral Ernest J. King is obviously the leader, were flabbergasted at the claims that were issued by MacArthur after Bismarck Sea because they were reading the same stats and everybody knew what was right and what was wrong. Tell us about this.
And the point here is that MacArthur knew the truth.
Yes, he did.
You know, if you've got people in the field over-reporting, as you know, we'll be kind to the Japanese, where the people in the field over-reporting their actual military success to the Japanese leaders, and then they proclaim that they've sunk ships that they hadn't sunk. It's one thing, but MacArthur knew what the truth was, and he was just making this stuff up in order to make the Navy look bad. U.S. Navy leaders were astonished at these bloated claims and direct shot at the Navy. It wasn't like he was trying to mislead the Japanese. He was trying to mislead the American public with respect to the U.S. Navy's success. Admirals in Washington demanded that George Marshall bring his man MacArthur to heel. When Marshall, who knew the actual results, he knew the truth too, of the Bismarck Sea, suggested to MacArthur that he should revise his estimates and tell the truth. Just say you made a mistake, Mac, and just tell the people what actually happened. MacArthur wasn't, calling. He wasn't conciliatory. He exploded. He told his boss that Marshall should revise his statements and proceeded to provide a list of names of every Japanese ship his units had supposedly sunk, that everybody knew that he hadn't. Going even further, MacArthur told Marshall that he was prepared to defend his claims either publicly or officially. In other words, if Marshall corrected the record, MacArthur would go to the press and tell the press that Marshall was wrong. He then added that he wanted to know the names of the men who disputed his claims so that he may take appropriate actions, including action against those responsible if circumstances warrant. His ego had gone completely into overdrive. He absolutely knew beyond the shadow of a doubt that Marshall would never have brought the issue to the public's eye. Marshall would never have brought this lie public. At this point, MacArthur knew that he was untouchable. The monster created by the American press, specifically William Randolph Hearst, who was also trying to back his bid for the Republican nomination of president against FDR, had allowed him to grow by FDR and was now a Godzilla-like stature that not even the big boss of the world's most powerful army, George Marshall, could stop, Seth.
Yeah. And when he sends those responses, if you want to call them that, back to George Marshall, that is a threat. That is a direct threat to George Marshall, basically saying, try and stop me, fool, because you can't. And he knew it. MacArthur knew that there was nothing that George Marshall could do, because if George Marshall turned around and said, look, all these estimates that MacArthur was saying were lies to the American press or the American public, then the American public is going to say, well, what else are lies? What else are you lying to us about in the middle of this war? Because again, remember, this is 1943, in the middle of this war that could go either way in the eyes of the American public. What else are you lying to us about? He knew he couldn't touch him. So MacArthur had good.
What I was going to say is, I want to make sure that this doesn't come across as a Navy versus Army diatribe. It is not. MacArthur's forces, his combined forces, including the Australians, the Kiwis, and the U.S. Army and the U.S. Army Air Forces were performing heroically.
Absolutely.
They were heroes. This is 100% dugout Doug we're railing against right now. And we're not going to continue this throughout the episode. But at this point in the war, 100% dugout Doug.
And you mentioned, Bill, you said FDR, because FDR had allowed it to grow, had allowed this MacArthur cult of personality to grow to, massive stature. And the thing is that MacArthur absolutely detested FDR, hated him vehemently. He blamed FDR for leaving his command to hang, and blamed the president for not sending help to the Philippines in 1941, 1942. The fact that there was absolutely no way that the U.S. could have saved the Philippines, or the fact that MacArthur's atrocious planning and execution were a primary reason for the initial failure, were apparently unseen by MacArthur. He saw no fault of his own when it came to the loss of the Philippines. He blamed everyone else but himself. But he especially blamed the president and his, quote, pet service, the United States Navy. Mac also believed that the, quote, desk-bound, and I'm using these quotes because that's what he called them, desk-bound generals in DC had sabotaged himself personally. He felt that he had no political influence, at least that's what he told people. He fully believed that by grabbing more influence or even more power, like, say, the White House, only then could he allocate the right amount of forces towards his obsession of liberating the Philippines. By having singular authority absorbing Nimitz's forces, no lie, only then could he free, quote, his people, unquote. His obsession with the Philippines often put the ultimate goal of the war, that being the most direct route to Japan, in jeopardy through his antics. Under absolutely no circumstances would his road to the Philippines be jeopardized or bypassed. If you go back and read his communiques back to Marshall, and then they're there, he's constantly whining and moaning and complaining that he does not have the forces that he needs to get the job done, that they're sending everything to Europe, that he doesn't have the aircraft he needs. And truth be told, they were second on the list. That is no lie. But he's just playing this poor, pitiful me stage show throughout the whole thing. Meanwhile, as you just said, his forces are accomplishing goals. His forces are winning great victories, and they're making progress. But he's whining and crying and complaining. He's a petulant child throughout the whole thing, and it keeps building and building and building and building and building until this 1944 era that we're about to get into. But Bill, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is his ultimate goal. What was MacArthur's ultimate goal here?
To aggrandize himself. I'm not sure. You know,
Yeah.
Confidentially remarking to General Eichelberger, he says, "They're afraid of me, Bob. I know I'll fight them in the newspapers. I will win every war. I'll win the war every morning with my communiques." He absolutely had to convince the public that the JCS and FDR were withholding support for his drive to the Philippines. Was the political influence of MacArthur real? Indeed, it was. So much so that even though he later denied it, he indeed was considering accepting the Republican nomination for president in 1944, if he should be so nominated. He absolutely cooperated and conspired with high-powered Republicans of the day all of whom detested FDR and his New Deal policies. Those same politicians felt MacArthur was their best bet in defeating FDR for his reelection in 44. I mean, the self-amplification and petulance, was he needed no megaphone. He could get the word out on the Republican ticket and things like that. So, proof point. When did MacArthur's candidacy reach Secretary of War Henry Stimson? This word caused Stimson to announce MacArthur's supposed to be fighting a war. And in the back room, he's politicking to get nominated to be president. So Stimson decides and makes an announcement that active duty officers could not remain in uniform while running for office. This was seen as a shot across Mac's bow, and his cronies, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, yes, named Vandenberg Air Force Base. Is it still an Air Force Base, or is it a Space Force Base? And Congressman Hamilton Fish both publicly denounced the Stimson ruling. Both of these so-called gentlemen received personal letters of thanks from MacArthur following their public outcry against Stimson. Since 1944, people have said that Mac's play for the nomination was only an effort to pressure FDR for more resources. Either way, he wouldn't get it. But it is an area of the Pacific War that has to be discussed, because it most certainly did have an influence on future dealings and decisions by both MacArthur and senior military leaders. So this whole business of MacArthur's petulance about the Philippines, is it just petulance, or is there some actual military strategy around, the debate between the Philippines and Formosa, Seth?
Well, it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
I mean, we all know Mac was a petulant child for sure. However, 100% he did have a goal of going back to the Philippines. And we've said this before. It was an obsession. It was an obsession. And his constant crying over lack of resources and lack of this and lack of that and lack of support. And, they're trying to stop me from doing this and they don't want me to do that. It all pointed towards one goal, and that was liberating the Philippines, namely Luzon, by the way. So in March of 1944, the JCS, Joint Chiefs Staff, ordered MacArthur and Nimitz to cooperate in seizing the Palaus, which of course, as we know, is Peleliu, and Mindanao by November 1944.
Mindanao's in the Philippines, for those.
Indeed. Yeah. Indeed. But following those, and this gets confusing here. This gets confusing here, admittedly so pay attention. But following those orders, the JCS was unsure where the road would go after that. MacArthur, of course, is screaming from the mountaintops for the Philippines. Mac wanted to go straight to Luzon and liberate his beloved Manila. Admiral King and the majority of the JCS favored bypassing Luzon altogether and aiming the next dagger at the large island of Formosa. The JCS was split on the decision, so much so that they issued orders to both commanders to plan for both operations, with both having a commencement date of February 1945. Now, we know damn well that even as all-powerful as the Pacific Force was in 1944, or at this point, 1945, theoretically, there is no way we could have pulled off two massive invasions like that. And we're going to get into the specifics of those suckers here in just a few minutes. There's no way. So even the JCS at this stage in 1944 does not know where the heck they want to go. So they knew full well that taking either island would eventually result in victory. As I said, at this stage, the U.S. could do whatever it wanted and would ultimately come out on top. However, there was a limit to our resources. The question wasn't necessarily whether or not we would win, not both at the same time, but either one, mind you, but which island was the quicker road to victory. That's the ultimate goal here, is to get this war over with as soon as possible. Which location would provide the quicker road to victory, Bill?
Yeah, so again, Seth is exactly right when it comes to invasion of either the Philippines or Formosa would eventually result in victory of that battle. Okay, the question becomes at what cost? Formosa is about a third closer to Japan than the Philippines is. So it's a much shorter hop. It's a much more direct route. And the question now becomes one of, what's the intel say about the Japanese forces in both locations? And, if they're equally difficult, Formosa is clearly the more direct path. You isolate the Philippines like we've done for the entire island hopping campaign, just starve them out. And, eventually when we win the war, they'll give up. If Formosa is substantially more difficult, more challenging, from a combat effectiveness standpoint, then maybe the Philippines might be a better choice, even though it's further away. So there's a lot of moving pieces in this decision. So in 1943, the JCS issued the strategic plan for the defeat of Japan. The plan envisioned a vital role for China in the final stages of the war. Both, because China is an enormous force. China is China. And so you can imagine wanting to bring them into the fight. China would be used as a staging base for U.S. bombing raids on the home islands. In order to accomplish this, the U.S. would need to land troops on the coast of China and defeat any and all Japanese forces in the area. The island of Formosa loomed large in that plan. Now, I'm going off script a little bit here, Seth, but the mind, you wonder what the grand strategic implications are 50 years post-war, 80 years post-war. If we had relieved the pressure on China and we were seen as, allies to the beleaguered Chinese who suffered significantly during this war, right? And if we kind of relieved the safety valve off of China, what the strategic implications would be today.
Yeah.
And that's a question that remains unanswered. However, the capture from Formosa would provide a springboard to China and ultimately would help bring Japan to their knees faster, at least as it pertains to China, but also as it pertains to Japanese homeland, by engaging the strategic bombing force that was now being built, and of course, landing in the Marianas and places like that. The Navy always feeling that the route to Japan lay through the Central Pacific, from the Marianas to Formosa to the mainland of Japan, at least initially, and approved of Formosa as the large target for late 44 and early 45. The Navy weren't the only ones who favored this policy. The Joint Strategic Survey Committee, JSSC, long said that the most direct route to Japan and ultimately forcing them to surrender or be invaded, lay through the Central Pacific and Formosa, Seth.
Yeah, this is nothing. This is nothing new. This is the reason that we went to Bayshio. This is the reason that we went to the Marshall Islands. This is one of the reasons that we went to the Marianas. So the Navy is sticking with their plan that they have been practicing through the whole war here. Even General George Marshall, by mid-1944, felt the same. Marshall urged MacArthur, to the latter's absolute fury, to re-examine the current strategic map of the Pacific after the fall of the Marianas. Now, so we're talking July, August 1944. It was clear, Marshall said, that the route to Japan was straight ahead. Again, if we look at a map, which I'm going to show now, the Philippines would not be an advance towards the enemy. It would be like trying to score a touchdown by running to the sidelines. And it's 100% true. Taking the Philippines would do nothing towards the objective of victory. The objective at this time, again, keep in mind, is the direct route to Japan, cutting Japan off, cutting the head off the snake. The Japanese were weak, Marshall said, and it was time to speed up the tempo. If the Allies would eventually require a port on the coast of China, wouldn't it be wise to capture Formosa now? Marshall told MacArthur, quote, "We must be careful not to allow our personal feelings and Philippine political considerations to override our great objective, which is the early conclusion of the war with Japan. In my view, bypassing is in no way synonymous with abandonment. On the contrary, by the defeat of Japan at the earliest practicable moment, the liberation of the Philippines will be effected in the most expeditious and complete manner possible," unquote. That is General George Marshall in a communique to General Douglas MacArthur, Bill.
Yeah, and so no surprise, Mac disagreed, saying only that we have a great national obligation to discharge. And to be clear, Mac's desire to liberate the Philippines was genuine.
Absolutely.
It was honorable and it was heartfelt. He may also have been tinged with a bit of guilt as to how things went down in 1942. On the King side, behind closed doors, King questioned MacArthur's ability to command. In the Fleet Admiral's mind, MacArthur was no strategist. He had no inkling as to the ins and outs of amphibious warfare, and his predictions of disaster after disaster in the Central Pacific, Peleliu notwithstanding, had proven to be false. Peleliu was, the only place where basically we really, really screwed up. King made mention of his one off-the-record press briefings, that the liberation of the Philippines was, quote, sentimentally desirable, but eccentric, unquote. Others agreed. Admiral Daniel Barbary, Mac's amphibious fleet commander, said of Mac's whole Philippines obsession, MacArthur seemed more interested in making good his promise to return to the Philippines than he did in winning the war. And that's a tough, tough claim by one of your subordinate commanders, Seth.
Yeah, but it's true. It's 100% true. Not that Mac didn't want to win the war. Obviously he did, but his obsession with returning to the Philippines clearly on multiple occasions clouded his actual view of the way the war was going to be fought. And that's the whole point in all of this. And it all comes to a head in July of 1944. So that whole, preconceived notion in most people's heads that, oh, we were just after Peleliu, we're going to the Philippines, or rather, because most people don't even know Peleliu happened, after the Marianas, we're just going to go to the Philippines. And that was just always on the map. No, it was not. It was not. And even in July 1944, it still was not. On July 13th, go ahead, Bill.
Well, I'm going to jump in here, Seth, just to say something. It's going to sound like at this point in our episode, Seth and Bill changed their mind. And, because we're going to start softening on the Philippines strategy. But what you've got to keep in mind as you listen to this, folks, is what we knew at the time.
Yes.
Right? What was the United States military's position based on what they knew at the time? And it's going to sound like we're going to start saying MacArthur was right about the Philippines. And we may start saying that. But he wasn't right about the Philippines based on what we knew at the time.
Exactly.
What happens is exposition. And we're going to discover some new material that MacArthur didn't know, which he couldn't have used to justify his desire to go to the Philippines, that's going to cause people to start softening on their position, on their decision about the Philippines. Okay, sorry about that interlude, Seth, but go ahead.
No, that's fine. It's important to note that too, because I know, it sounds like we're piling on, and in fact we are, but it all snowballs. It all snowballs. You can't just start talking about liberating the Philippines without going back to the roots. And the main man who is pushing for all of this the entire time is one cat, one dude. And, there were two options on the table to theoretically get the war over with sooner. And we want to go down this road because we kind of alluded to this in previous episodes before, and we've never really explored the reasons why things went the way they went. And here we go. So on July 13th, 1944, Admiral King flew to Pearl Harbor to meet with Nimitz and then on to Saipan to discuss future operations, specifically his idea and plan to capture Formosa. After touring Saipan, King, Nimitz, and Spruance rode out to the USS Indianapolis, Bill's favorite ship, and had dinner. And Bill, this is indeed the scene where all the flies.
The horse flies, yeah. When remember all the fatalities on Saipan,
Right.
All these horse flies was surrounding the area from all the corpses on the island, and some of them flew out to the ship that were anchored just offshore and invaded the wardroom during this dinner.
Yes.
And so they were, tormented by these horse flies while they're trying to have this strategic conversation in the wardroom of the Indianapolis.
Yeah, and well, they're trying to decide or at least get input on the further prosecution of the Pacific War. They are bombarded by these bloated flies. During the after dinner talk, after they literally retreat out of the wardroom and I guess sit around and drink coffee, King asked Raymond Spruance what he thought of invading Formosa. The man who would command the invasion, Ray Spruance, spoke quickly and directly, saying, quote, "Sir, I don't like Formosa," unquote. Just typical Spruance. Ow, right to the point. I'm not going to beat around the bush. Here it is. Spruance had earned the right to speak, and his voice had a lot of heft to it in King's mind. But Spruance wasn't the only one in the United States Navy who didn't like the idea of taking Formosa. Even though, as we said, the JCS were like, yep, Formosa's the right way to go. The Navy, the actual practitioners and executioners, if you want to call it that, of the plan are saying, I don't really think so. Operation Causeway.
But it's because of this intelligence that's about to come in that Spruance understood and was yet to be revealed. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yep. That's fine. Operation Causeway, as it was now dubbed, was not looked on favorably by those who would be responsible for its execution at all. And here is why. Senior officers doubted whether it would be worth the tremendous effort and lives that it would require to take the large island of Formosa. It was known, or at least assumed, that tens of thousands of Japanese were on Formosa. Intel estimated northwards of 300 to 400,000 enemy troops. The forces that would be required for this would be massive. Planning estimates later stated that over 500,000 Army troops and 154,000 Marines would be required to take the island. And that does not even count the service personnel that would be involved later. As the numbers began to pile up, literally, Causeway looked like it would rival Overlord in terms of size and scope. You put in the notes, Bill, how does this compare with what would be required for the Philippines? About half. I mean, we're going to send about 150,000 guys into the Philippines on Leyte, but we're talking almost, by my notes, over a 500,000 people to take Formosa. This is huge
I got
operation.
This point that this was revealed after we got close to Formosa and we could do these overflights and start developing more richer intel. This was not known by MacArthur
No.
when he was arguing so aggressively against Formosa for the last 2 years. So, yeah, Spruance is saying, my goodness, this is huge. This is way harder than we thought it was going to be. Nimitz is now starting to come around to Spruance's position. Go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, no, but it's 100% true, because once once these senior officers who are going to have to execute this mission start looking at it, everything on paper, they're going, Jesus God, I mean, it's huge, huge. And the thing with the Philippines is, yes, Lady was, or no, Lady was not a small operation. We know that it was tremendous. However, the Philippines operations were step by step by step. So after Lady, we go to Luzon. And I mean, that's an even bigger operation in Luzon.
Yeah.
But we had the time to build those forces. We're talking about multiple thousands of nautical miles from the Marianas to Formosa to transport this tremendous amount of people and material. Our transportation and material assets were tremendous by 1944, but even by those 1944 standards, acquiring that many people, acquiring that much material, and then moving it would have been a damn near impossible task, even for the United States Navy in 1944 in the Pacific. It would have easily been the largest operation in the Pacific until the invasion of Japan. That's how big this operation was going to be. But Admiral King, he's always going to try and get in the last word. He doesn't let go, does he?
Yeah, because Formosa is still the better strategic move until you start considering new intel and the cost of it. So despite the objections from Spruance and others, he doubled down on Formosa. When Admiral Towers suggested that neither Guam nor Saipan could supply sufficient port facilities to support the invasion of Formosa, King ignored him. And Towers was a pretty obstinate dude as himself.
Yes,
Towers further added that the Navy, in other words, King, if the Navy was to pursue this plan, then that would have to shift supplies and priority from the building of airstrips in the Marianas to support the B-29 operations against Japan, which surely would raise the ire of the U.S. Army Air Forces, because the Army Air Forces needed the Navy to build those airfields so they could do the strategic bombing from Japan. But we'd have to shift all that effort to support the invasion of Formosa. A high-level meeting involving FDR, MacArthur, and Nimitz was set for the immediate future in Pearl Harbor. This is another, noteworthy moment in the Pacific War. FDR comes to Pearl Harbor on the USS Baltimore, I believe it was.
Yes.
Cruiser, and Nimitz tells King that trying to take Formosa without having Luzon in his pocket would be a very risky objective. Japanese air power on Luzon posed a large threat to any operation in or around Formosa. So, Seth, FDR comes into Pearl Harbor on the Baltimore. What happens?
Yeah, it gets even more intriguing here. So, as the president pulls into Pearl Harbor aboard the USS Baltimore, the docks. So first of all, this was supposed to be a secret trip. Like nobody was supposed to know except for Nimitz and the other high levels that FDR was coming. Turns out the cat got out of the bag. The whole friggin' of island of Oahu was out to meet FDR when the Baltimore pulls up and his entourage goes away from Pearl Harbor over to Waikiki. The docks are lined with dignitaries, bands, and all the hoopla that one would imagine that would occur with a presidential visit. Nimitz is there in his whites with his entire staff to greet the commander-in-chief. So was MacArthur, except he was not. Mac was supposed to be there to meet FDR, and after his airplane landed at Hickam Field, an hour before the USS Baltimore tied up, and instead of greeting the president, MacArthur went to General Richardson's quarters to shower and change his uniform.
He put on his dress white uniform, right? Just like Nimitz, didn't
he? Nope. An awkward situation developed in which MacArthur declined to meet the president on time. No lie. I am not making this up. He said, nope, I'm not going to meet him. I'm going to go shower. I've had a long flight. Honest to God. This forces Franklin Delano Roosevelt to ask General Richardson, quote, will you get hold of him, unquote, as he's sitting on the deck of the USS Baltimore with Nimitz and all these other high-level authorities. Mac is nowhere to be seen. Mac's arrival, but he was there. Mac's arrival on scene well over an hour later was heralded by sirens, a motorcycle escort, and an enormous limousine with an open top. The only person seated in the back of the limousine was MacArthur. Instead of his dress uniform, as literally every single other officer was wearing, MacArthur stepped out of his vehicle wearing his makeshift Philippine Field Marshal khakis and leather A2 jacket, prompting the president to say, quote, why don't you wear proper clothes when you visit me, Douglas, unquote. How much of a slap in the face can you give somebody?
Yeah, he doesn't think
can't make it
much
up.
of the chief. From all accounts, that the meeting was very friendly, despite the opening, despite the fact that MacArthur did not like FDR, nor did he trust him. As a matter of fact, on the airplane ride from Australia to Hawaii, Mac paced the inside of his airplane, broke into one of his infamous monologues, and told his pilot that he had no idea why he was being summoned to meet the president. Apparently unaware of the fact that Nimitz, too, was going to be invited to the meeting, MacArthur had presumed the whole event would be about him, even fearing that he was about to be relieved of command. Maybe this is why he didn't put on his dress uniform. His thoughts on the meeting ranged from that to whether or not he would be allowed to go to the Philippines or have his command reduced to a holding action in New Guinea, which Mac personally felt was actually what was going to happen. Over the next few days, Mac, Nimitz, and FDR met in a little bungalow in Waikiki. A very famous photograph of Nimitz holding up a long pointer at a map that was very posed. And Nimitz is pointing at a random spot on the map so as not to give away any intel. And they discussed Pacific strategy. Notes from the meeting are almost non-existent. And the only real record is from Mac's notebook, Reminiscence, which is a fair and balanced treatment of the Pacific War. It doesn't at all overrepresent MacArthur's impact on the war. Others state that the meeting flowed after FDR pointed to Mindanao and asked Mac, Douglas, where do we go from here? FDR had tossed Mac a bone. And from there on, Mac went into one of his biblical speeches, starting with Genesis and going all the way to Daniel, about solemn duty and oaths given to the Philippine people. The glorious Douglas MacArthur army would rescue the Philippine people, Seth.
Yeah. So ultimately, FDR, who, by the way, was a master politician, like him or not, the guy was a master politician. He knew exactly what was going on through this whole damn time. He was not fooled by any of this. He presses MacArthur. Go ahead.
Yeah, once he says, where do we go from Mindanao? He knew he had him. He knew he had him.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. FDR was a master puppeteer, shall we say. He presses MacArthur. So MacArthur actually, when he says, where do we go from here? MacArthur gives accurate and pointed views on why Luzon should be captured before any move on Formosa was made. Mac spoke by all accounts like a strategic genius. And I put in my notes, I'm not being sarcastic here. I'm being dead serious. Speaking of amphibious landing after landing, all supported by leapfrogging land-based aerial coverage. He made mention that land, sea, and air could move together and be mutually supporting, and that Luzon offered multiple landing sites, which it does. He would draw upon local intel and guerrillas to get pre-landing intel so as to better prepare his plans. Again, he's got all this laid out in his brain, and he's been thinking about this since 1942 for crying out loud. Yeah, literally, for 2 years, he's been thinking about this. He also pointed out correctly, I add, that the intel gathered on the Philippines, specifically Luzon, would be far more accurate than anything that could be gathered on Formosa. Formosa had been a Japanese colony since the last century, and like Saipan, had been blocked from Western eyes. Nimitz dutifully agreed that Luzon would be the better choice as a target, as he was never on board with Formosa in the first place. Mack went even further and said that once in American hands, Luzon would be the springboard from which Allied air power would reign supreme over the South China Sea. Here, he was inaccurate, but nonetheless, he wasn't that far off the mark, Bill.
No, he wasn't. Yeah, so FDR ran the meeting. I guess it's, it wouldn't be too kind to say that FDR was, as you said, a master politician and a puppeteer, throwing bones when required to get people to believe that he was fully on board, constantly quizzing MacArthur on enemy troop strengths in the area. Mack dodged until FDR plainly asked Douglas, "How many Japanese are there on the Philippine Islands?" MacArthur responded, "About 100,000. And in fact, I think at this point, MacArthur called him Franklin. About 100,000, Franklin. And they are scattered all over the archipelago, so they don't have mass. Here's where Mack engaged his reality distortion machine. U.S. intel suggested that as many as 176,000, almost twice as many as he was telling the president, were in the Philippines, and Mack knew that to be the case. Actual Japanese numbers were closer to 250,000. So intel was actually underestimating the actual number, although the number was still less than would likely have been found in Formosa. It would generate a significantly tougher fight than Mack was representing to his commander-in-chief. While pressed about casualties by FDR, Mack spoke instead about the high casualties in Nimitz's theater, with Nimitz sitting there stone-faced.
Yeah.
So he's poking the admiral in the chest in front of the president, and Nimitz just bites his tongue. The following day, Nimitz had the floor and dutifully proposed King's Causeway plan, as King had ordered him to do, Seth.
And, Mack never shied away from pointing the finger, not necessarily at Nimitz directly, but, as we always say, the buck stops with the boss. And he's always pointed the finger at high casualties suffered by the Marines at places like Baishio, Saipan, Peleliu, and he's basically said, look, my guys aren't suffering that many casualties. Well, no, they're not. But he never missed an opportunity to point that out. And Nimitz, like you said, Bill, just sat there like the great stone face and took it as the professional that he was. Apparently, upon cross-examination by FDR, Nimitz spoke frankly and did not hide his reservations about Causeway, instead making two concessions for Luzon over Formosa. Nimitz admitted that he could support Luzon with his current forces, and obviously he does, unlike Formosa, and that Manila would require a heavy input from everyone, and it did. Anyone could see that Luzon was the leader in the race, but Mack went further, going into another one of his trademark diatribes about the moral obligation to liberate the Filipinos, and on and on and on. The following day, Mack left and went back to Australia, telling his pilot he had won. As a matter of fact, Admiral Leahy, who's somebody we need to talk about, Bill, we haven't talked about him, but we need to do an episode on Leahy because he's an important figure in this whole thing. Yes. Leahy told MacArthur, quote, "I'll go along with you, Douglas," unquote. Regarding, I remember
Leahy was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Yes. So he carries great weight with Marshall as well.
Yes, he does. So after leaving Pearl Harbor, Admiral Leahy, who was with FDR on the ride back to the United States, or actually on the way back to Alaska, wrote in his diary that in the meeting, both Nimitz and MacArthur had agreed that, quote, "Japan can be forced to accept our terms of surrender by the use of sea and air power without an invasion of the Japanese homeland." Again, remember, guys, this is 1944, unquote. Both theater commanders wanted to avoid an invasion of the home islands, if at all possible, especially Nimitz and the Navy. By cutting off Japanese supply lines to the natural resources they regularly acquired via the Philippines, Borneo, and Sumatra, this could and probably would hasten the end of the war. While the capture of Formosa would endanger the sea lanes, and it would have, the capture of the Philippines would sever those sea lines of communications in that area as well as deprive them of the resources in the archipelago, Bill.
Yeah, that's right. So on his way back to the States, FDR wrote Mac a letter saying, "As soon as I get back, I will push that plan, for I am convinced that on the whole, it is logical and can be done. Someday there will be a flag raising in Manila, and without question, I want you to do it, Douglas." However, even the strength of FDR's letter had not actually decided the issue, because the way FDR set up the structure, the JCS had the authority to make the decision, believe it or not, and we're still unsure of the matter. As a matter of fact, on July 27th, JCS still issued a statement to Nimitz and MacArthur to proceed with plans to bypass Luzon and land troops in Formosa at the earliest practicable date. To be clear, these were not orders to execute anything. Within modern parlance, we would call it a warning order, not a movement order, an execute order. But it was clear that the intentions of the JCS lay at that time, where the intentions of the JCS lay at that time. King, a member of the JCS, certainly had serious swing in this game at this stage. Further complicating matters, the JCS sent another message stating some Southwest Pacific air, ground, and service forces would be necessary in Operation Causeway, the invasion of Formosa. These assets will not be returned, but will be retained by Pacific Fleet for post-Causeway operations. Again, to be clear, this was a planning message, a warning order, not an execution order, but that had to both befuddle and enrage Mac at the same time, and frankly, rightfully so.
Yeah. Man, when he read that last part, when they said that he was going to lose forces and they were going to be retained by Pac Fleet, he must have just blew a gasket. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when he read that message. Yeah. Naturally, he goes into an absolute tirade. He writes to Marshall complaining that bypassing Luzon and cutting it off would lead to famine and mass deaths on the citizenry of the Philippines. Allied POWs. Yeah. Allied POWs would.
Good. I'm sorry. Again?
What's that?
No, I said which happens anyway.
Yeah. Allied POWs would most certainly die of starvation, if not executed outright. And all of his statements were more than likely true. And as we will see, unfortunately, most of them happen regardless. It's these statements, Mac is trying to swing the personal and, moral feelings of the JCS in his favor. And they made absolutely no impression on the JCS at all, many of which, even at this stage, still firmly believe that the road to Tokyo lay through the Central Pacific, which it did, i.e. Formosa. So back in Pearl Harbor, planning for Causeway continued despite opposition from nearly all involved. The loudest voice of opposition was Spruance, who hated the idea. As it's going on further and further, Spruance likes it less and less every minute. Spruance, and this is interesting here. Think about this. We don't do counterfactuals, but think about this for a minute. This is July 1944. Probably right now about early August. Spruance wanted to seize Iwo Jima and Okinawa now. Now, Okinawa admittedly could not be seized until later, but he wanted to seize Iwo Jima right now. Did not want to waste time doing anything else anywhere else. He did not think that the Philippines would move us towards our strategic objectives, and felt that by seizing both of these islands, specifically Iwo, right now, it would shorten the war and put the U.S. at a point on the map where they could obliterate anything around them, including Formosa and Luzon, through siege and air power. Think about this, Bill. If the United States, specifically the Central Pacific Force, United States Marine Corps and Navy, lands on Iwo Jima in October 1944, which, as we know and we will see, that Kurabayashi starts building his forces and fortifications on there in late October, November 1944, how would that have changed the bloodbath that Iwo Jima actually became if they had invaded? And they had the people to do it in 1944 as opposed to February 45. I mean, that's just.
Yes, Seth, I've never pounded my desk in one of these episodes before. I'm pounding my desk. 2020 hindsight. Absolutely. 2020 hindsight.
Sure.
Spruance was right. Bypass the
Yes,
Philippines, and they don't build up the defenses on Iwo Jima. Bypass Formosa, and we don't have to worry about moving all those forces to the Pacific, post Normandy, so that we could, overcome this huge force that turns out to be on Formosa. You lose nothing, you gain everything. And, we had pretty good intel on Iwo at this point. Our intel degraded with time because the Japanese were given time to build up defenses, and we didn't track that. So our intel actually got worse on Iwo over time. So Spruance was right. He was even righter, is that a word, than Nimitz, who was supporting the move on Leyte and Luzon. And so counterfactuals, we don't normally do them, but in this case, what a difference it would have made to the conduct of the war. Fewer Marines would have died on Iwo. Fewer people would have died on the Philippines. And I'm talking about the massive Japanese destruction in Manila and all the murder that they conducted on civilians in Manila after we, landed at Lake Lingayen. This is a clear cut, if only, in my view, Seth.
Yeah. But, even after all of that, still, Causeway died a very slow death. On September the 9th, JCS finally issued orders stating that Leyte would be seized by December 20th, but also directed that planning should be made for both Formosa and Luzon. It was infuriating at this point. Still, in September, no firm decision. At this point, with Nimitz's, quote, off-the-record support, unquote, Mac laid it all out on the table. Sending a long cable to JCS, MacArthur said that his plans were as follows, and I'm going to read this verbatim. From Leyte, I would proceed to Luzon and liberate Manila by February. 4 amphibious landings by 4 divisions will occur at Lingayen Gulf by December 20th. These ops would require the support of the entire Pacific Fleet. Now here, once ashore, MacArthur's forces would push north and continue until Luzon was captured, utilizing existing air bases or building new ones, thus utilizing land-based air and releasing the fleet to do whatever they needed to do simultaneously. Mac then continues by saying that by capturing Luzon, the Formosa operation would be useless, and it would, and said that an attack on Iwo Jima would be more supportive of the goal to stage attacks on Kyushu should they be needed. So at this point, Mac is actually swinging for both sides of the fence. He's supporting Raymond Spruance at the same time, while also supporting his own goals. And Bill, his proposal was all good, but the key factor here is it would not require redistribution of forces from Europe, and which Causeway would have, right?
That was a huge issue, right? So we weren't, European theater of operations was not resolved. We did not know. I mean, when did the Battle of Bulge happen? December, right. I mean, so there's still, a lot of support needed for those troops that have landed on the European, in Europe. And so now we're going to take a bunch of those support forces, service support forces, and swing them to the Pacific for Formosa. Yeah, so this is a big deal. And finally, the JCS relents. And I believe that mostly it's the service. It's the fact that they'd have to draw forces from Europe to do Formosa that caused them to relent, not because they believed it was the wrong strategic move, but they said, you know what, we could support both theaters more easily, more quickly, if we don't do Formosa. That became, I think, the tipping point. And they admitted defeat. The die had been cast. The JCS finally issued orders for Mac to hit Luzon in December 44, Iwo, Nimitz to hit Iwo in January 45. We know that slips to February. and a multi-branch assault on Okinawa in March 45. That's Army and Navy, Marine Corps, right? So the final blueprint for the rest of the war had been drawn up and distributed. Of course, that then points towards a large land invasion of Japan, which was also being teed up, but not before the supporting battles occurred. Seth.
Yeah. And, I think you're 100% right in saying that the JCS realized, too, that just the sheer size of what Formosa would have been was not something that they could support with a good heart, not, in the midst of an ongoing European war that you had exactly said. By September 1944, we just finished Operation Market Garden, which, by the way, was a failure. And, we had not won that war by any stage yet. So transferring materiel and men from Europe to Pacific to get Formosa, which is what it would have required. The JCS says, nah, this ain't going to happen. And I believe you're 100% right. Formosa may have been the more strategically desirable place to be, but it just could not be supported at that time. So, yeah, I think you're dead on the mark there. So, all in all, MacArthur obviously wins his case. He had won theoretically on both merit and sentiment, but with significantly more drama than was required. One of MacArthur's tendencies, as you put it in the notes here, Bill, was never to try and win an argument through logic alone when there was an opportunity to engage in publicity-enhancing histrionics or polemics. And that's very, very true, but that's the kind of guy he was. That's the kind of guy he was. He was an overly melodramatic guy that was going to do whatever he needed to do to get the job done. And, only time would tell if it was actually the right call. And, Bill, we just spent an hour and 20 minutes or whatever it was talking about this because it all plays through with what happens for the rest of the war. It wasn't a preconceived notion that we were going to go to the Philippines. And we wanted people to understand that it wasn't just poof and here we are, that there was actually some serious thought about cutting them off altogether and letting them wither on the vine and just moving on to Formosa as the more direct route to the war. And as you said, several minutes ago, Bill, how history would have changed had we gone that way. It's something definitely to think about. It's
or
an intriguing
bypass
topic.
both
Yeah.
and gone straight to Iwo, right? Which in retrospect, this would probably have been the right call. None of the above. It's one of those multiple choice questions: A, B, both A and B, or none of the above. And turns out none of the above.
Yeah. It's definitely an intriguing topic and kind of somewhat sort of, but not really out of the realm of our normal topics of conversation. But, we thought it was just too damn intriguing, too fascinating, and probably too little, known to not address these topics. And, everything built up from, the time that MacArthur was ordered out of the Philippines in 1942 until finally the time that the JCS puts their stamp of approval on landing at Luzon, at Leyte first and then Luzon. And as we know how things turns out, and we're gonna get into the weeds on that here in the very, very near future. So, Bill, is there anything else you want to cast into this net of intrigue as we get ready to move into the Philippines operation?
No, I think I'm going to take a week off, but then I shall return.
Well played. Well played. So with that, we want to thank you for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Wherever you receive your podcast, give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. Also, if you want to see the video version of this and any of our other episodes, please tune into our YouTube channel called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. If you have a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, I am Seth Parrott, and thank you very much for listening. Bill.
I'm Bill Tody. See you again next week.